The MCU had a pretty spectacular reputation throughout the first three phases, which together are known as the Infinity Saga, but something has clearly changed, especially since the beginning of Phase 4, with this new era of the MCU, otherwise known as the Multiverse Saga, having been far more poorly received, maybe because of some sort of superhero fatigue that has definitely not helped by the sheer amount of content released during each year and each phase, including a lot of different TV shows and even specials. But what about the movies themselves? Are they really that much worse? Well, with the release of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, since there won't be another MCU movie until November with the Marvels, this seems like a good time to look at every movie released as a part of the Multiverse Saga and rank them from worst to best, because if I am being honest, I think while there is an obvious downgrade from Phase 3, Phase 4, and so far Phase 5's movies are still a very solid group of movies. Phase 3 was just exceptional, so in comparison it doesn't look as good, but these movies do range from fine to, at points, amazing, with the single exception of one truly bad movie, Thor: Love and Thunder. Thor: Love and Thunder at the bottom of the list at number 9, as I've said multiple times in previous videos, is a joke of a movie that takes itself so insanely unseriously that it makes you wonder why they even made it at all. Thor is a goofy, blubbering idiot wearing the ugliest costume in the MCU ever, and whose maturity, in contrast to his age, has basically become a plot hole at this point. The villain, Gore, could have been interesting. Christian Bale does a fine job with what he's given, and the idea of a guy going around killing gods in a movie that conveys the complexities of godhood and shows how there are good ones and bad ones could have been really interesting, but not only do we not see him kill anyone, but also any intricacy to the idea is thrown out the window in two different directions. Gore is basically proven right, as every god is terrible, and Thor, the only good god, is a complete idiot. But Gore also kidnaps children to make it really clear that he's the bad guy, which is kind of just the plot of the movie. Gore kidnaps children, Thor goes to save them, which is a simple, not very engaging plot, and a lot of the choices in the plot and also characterization feel like excuses to tell jokes, which can become uncomfortable with Jane's cancer, especially when, surprisingly considering all of Taika Waititi's other movies, this movie isn't very funny. The jokes don't really land. There is a lot of jokes, it's a non-stop jokes, but most of them don't land, so they don't even have that. The movie isn't all bad necessarily. Jane as Thor is a fun character, and the way she uses Mjolnir is really cool, plus that one part in the black and white world was easily the highlight of the movie, but that doesn't save what is otherwise a very difficult movie to sit through with minimal entertainment value that completely ruins the character of Thor. This is easily, in my opinion, the worst movie in not just the Phase 4 era, but also the entirety of the Marvel Cinematic Universe ever. Black Widow is certainly an unusually placed movie in the MCU timeline. It is the first movie of Phase 4 and of the Multiverse Saga, but it also takes place in 2016, right after Civil War, and stars a character who is already dead. The movie stars Natasha, but it is far more important as the introductions of the characters of Yelena and Red Guardian, who will go on to appear elsewhere, but it is hard to look past the fact that Black Widow had already died, so her story in this movie doesn't really matter. It doesn't really need to happen, and the fact that she's already dead means that there's a lot less stakes than there typically are, at least for her. Putting that aside, I would be lying if I said I didn't at least enjoy this movie. Black Widow is a relatively fun adventure with decent action and fun character interactions, with especially Yelena, who is a highlight, but the movie is brought down by a not very thrilling spy thriller plot, a terrible main villain, a complete bastardization of an iconic Marvel's Comics villain, and some not very good CGI that has definitely been memed to death. And Black Widow is a movie that kind of feels unnecessary, and the actual movie I don't think does a good enough job to prove that it is. Both the Red Guardian and Yelena could have easily just been introduced somewhere else. There are definitely things I liked here, but they are cancelled out by the things I don't, making for a mediocre 5 out of 10 first movie in the Multiverse Saga. The rest of the movies in this video, I feel, have more positive things going for them than negatives, but they all definitely range in quality, starting with Quantumania, which is a very fun movie in its character interactions and some of the goofy Quantum Realm characters. The movie also has some very effective moments, both visually and in intensity, partially thanks to Kang, who's a great villain within the confines of this movie. On the other hand, most of the Quantum Realm is pretty ugly visually, with far too much reliance on CGI, and despite being in the title, the Wasp feels like a completely secondary character. In her own movie, Cassie Lang, on the other hand, feels like more of an important character, which is kind of to the detriment of this movie because this third actress to play her is far less effective in this emotional connection to her father's department compared to her predecessors, which is very unfortunate because that's the emotional crux of the movie, either because of the actress, the writing, or the directing, but that one scene featuring Cassie in Endgame held more emotional weight than the entirety of Quantumania. King is a great villain for most of the movie, but the third act kind of completely powers him down to allow Ant-Man to keep up, and who's defeated a bit too easily. In the end, I know I said all these complaints, but I did have fun with this movie. It is a fun, entertaining movie, but nothing more, really, which is a shame because I think Quantumania had the potential to be the best in the Ant-Man trilogy. Instead, it is let down by multiple missed opportunities. Black Panther: Wakanda Forever is incredibly depressing, starting with the off-screen death of the main character of the franchise due to the real death of the actor who plays him, and yeah, the tribute to Chadwick Boseman was very effectively handled, but I still think to this day, it was a mistake to let the character's fate be tied to the actor, because the movie just ends up being so depressing. It's a depressing pit of despair, where Shuri's forced through an insane amount of character development because of the deaths of her entire family. The grief from T'Challa's death was definitely effective, especially for Shuri's development, but it also lessens the impact of her mother's death, which I feel like was probably in some sort of initial script where T'Challa was still the main character. I just think killing off both T'Challa and Ramona was a bit too far. Namor, or Namor, is a great and complex villain with really unique and interesting powers and a well fleshed out backstory, with really the only negative about his whole character is that Talokan, alongside the rest of the movie, doesn't really have the best visuals. A lot of it is very poorly lit, which I guess complements the tone, but it is a bit too far. It doesn't really look good at all. Also, Ironheart feels out of place, like she doesn't really fit the intended plot, but was placed into the plot as a sort of advertisement for her show, which definitely doesn't need to happen. Wakanda Forever has great action, great acting, character development, and villains, but it is also just so depressing, not the best visually, and also at times a bit boring. I enjoyed it, I liked elements of it, and there are parts where I did get emotionally invested, which is why I think it is better than certain other movies on this list, but you can't get past the fact that at times it's kind of boring, which I don't think these movies should be. Eternals broke the MCU's insanely long streak of fresh ratings on Rotten Tomatoes, and while I do agree with a lot of the complaints that people in general have thrown at the movie, I don't really think it's given the credit that it deserves. Now yes, Eternals' plot doesn't justify its long runtime, nor is it very inventive. It's mostly just recruiting the entire time, and also Cersei, who's the lead, doesn't really have much of a personality, probably the least interesting of the Eternals, which doesn't help that the main romance of the movie, which does take up a lot of the movie, falls mostly flat, but there's a lot more I like about this movie than dislike. For instance, I think the action is fantastic, perfect uses of the various Justice League-like superpowers, which are used better and in combination than the actual Justice League movie. I mean, Makari's speedster abilities probably looks the best that any speedster abilities have ever looked. My favorite part of the movie is easily the story of Icarus, who's used very effectively as a part of the twist of the movie and as a conflicted and very personal main villain, with an interesting look at a character with a complete blind faith in their god, Arishem, and the commentary that arises from that. I also found the exploration of the cosmic lore of the MCU through Arishem and the Celestials to be fascinating, and I'm not totally sure why it was Eternals specifically that critics turned against, as I think it is, in my opinion, far from the worst MCU offering. Not the best per se, but certainly not the worst either. Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is a very long title given to a very solid movie. Shang-Chi is definitely one of the better of the newly introduced heroes in the Multiverse Saga, having been given a good character arc through this movie, helped by the main villain, Wen-Wu, who basically fixed the Mandarin twist from Iron Man 3 while also being a three-dimensional, complex, and personal main villain, and that is definitely effective. The movie also has some great action and its focus on over-the-top martial arts. Where I think the movie falters is in its final action scene, turning into this big dragon CGI fest instead of what should have been a small-scale personal one-on-one fight between Shang-Chi and his father. I think it would have been far better. I also do not like Awkwafina as the comic relief, and I hate how she helped to save the day at the end. Shang-Chi, however, is definitely a strong first entry in what can eventually maybe become a good trilogy, for a character that, honestly, I had never heard about until this movie was being made. But now it's possible that Shang-Chi will be getting a trilogy before almost any of the Justice Leaguers. Would you look at that? With an even longer title, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness seemed to have had a lot of hype surrounding it that seems to have turned into disappointment, which is a relatively strong and prevailing opinion that I simply cannot bring myself to agree with. People were clearly expecting more than what we got, but going in with more realistic expectations, which I did have, exploring a few other universes and the cameos that came along with it was awesome to me, in a movie that sure does have some cheesy dialogue, but also has some great action and character interactions alongside a great main villain in Scarlet Witch, who's this super creepy horror movie monster with an extra layer of complexity that allows for some very effective emotional moments for her character. In my opinion, Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness is a wild ride of an MCU movie with Sam Raimi's unique directing, great action, visuals, and villain. Certainly isn't perfect or anything, but much better than the way people have been talking about it on the internet, as they really seem to hate the writer of the movie. Again, I do think the movie had some cheesy dialogue, but I think the writer did a relatively decent job. It is, however, the directing and the acting and the action that brought it to the point where, yeah, it's pretty great. When it comes to the post-Endgame era of the MCU, there are two contenders for the best movies, as both Spider-Man No Way Home and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 are not just the best outings of the Multiverse Saga, but some of the best movies in the MCU ever. I'm talking top fives here, and for a lot of people, number one. It's clear that these two are the top two for this saga, but a much harder question to answer is which between the two is number one. Both movies are these hilarious, action-packed, character-driven, emotionally charged, hype-as-hell movies with incredible villains that perfectly cap off both of their respective trilogies, while also kind of retroactively making the previous two films in the trilogy even better than, in my opinion, they already were. No Way Home specifically brought together 3 generations of Spider-Man franchises, which naturally did make me cheer more than Guardians of the Galaxy, but it can be argued that those cheers were easy. Obviously, I was going to cheer for the 3 Spider-Men coming together. Guardians of the Galaxy made me cheer for things that I never thought I ever would cheer for, like Rocket Raccoon simply saying his comic book name, and that is, in my opinion, way more impressive. When it comes down to it, putting these two movies against each other, it's very hard to choose because they're equal in so many things. Maybe one movie does something better, but the other movie does something else better. However, that is how I chose, because I think while No Way Home is more hype, I think what Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 does better is just more valuable. I got more emotionally invested in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, a movie that made me cry several times over animals. That's not to say No Way Home is unemotional, because it definitely isn't. It would feel pretty hollow in just being fan service if it was unemotional, but Guardians is a bit heavier on the emotional weight, and because of this, out of the two, while they are very close in quality, and I would say both 10 out of 10 MCU movies, the second best Multiverse Saga movie in my opinion is Spider-Man No Way Home, and the best movie in the Multiverse Saga is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, but both are probably in my top 5 MCU movies ever, which just goes to show how much the post-Endgame era of the MCU has to offer. I think people have given it a lot of slack just because it doesn't live up to the Infinity Saga. It definitely doesn't live up to Phase 3, but some of these movies are fantastic, and while it doesn't live up to the greatest film series of all time, I think it is still pretty great and has a lot to offer.